Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of Islamabad Non-Proliferation Conference 2024. Yesterday's discussions provided us with rich and deep insights into the evolving dynamics of global security. Today, we continue to build on that momentum with equally significant topics and expert contributions. Our first session for today, Working Session 4, will focus on an important theme of responsible nuclear behavior, biases, and discrimination. Before we proceed further, I would like to make a few announcements. Today's program will be divided into 5 sessions, 2 working sessions, 2 supplementary sessions, and 1 special session. Each session will consist of a panel discussion. Following each session, there will be a dedicated question and answer session. Our sessions will also be live streamed on Zoom video conferencing and YouTube. For those who are attending via Zoom, please note that by default, the mics of all the attendees will be on the mute. Online participants are requested to kindly use Q&A option to type out their questions. Please include your name as well as institutional affiliation along with your question. While we fully encourage you to participate, we request you to please be brief in your questions. The audience is also requested to avoid long comments and not ask multiple questions. And we shall try our best to ensure that all the questions get answered within our allotted time. We have a very distinguished panel for today's discussions on responsible nuclear behavior, biases, and discrimination. The first speaker for Working Session 4 would be Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Adil Sultan is Dean Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies at the Air University, Islamabad, Pakistan since October 2020. He has served in Pakistan Air Force for over 31 years and retired as an Air Commodore. During his military career, he served at Strategic Plans Division at the Policy, Doctrine and Strategy Branch and Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs Directorate. His research interests include arms control, nuclear deterrence, and emerging technologies. Dr. Sultan has authored a book, several research articles in international and national journals. Our second speaker for this discussion would be Dr. Nicholas Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler is a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. He is a non-resident senior fellow at BASIC, where he works on the BASIC Nuclear Responsibilities Program. His publications include The Security Dilemma, Fear, Cooperation, and Trust in World Politics, published in 2008, Saving Strangers, Humanitarian Intervention in International Society, published in 2000, and Trusting Enemies, Interpersonal Relationships in International Conflict, 2018. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the United Kingdom, a fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and he has an entry into Who's Who since 2011. Our third guest speaker for this discussion will be Dr. Anastasia Malagina. Dr. Anastasia Malagina is an associate professor and director of the Cross-Disciplinary Center for Global Biosecurity Studies at St. Petersburg State University. Dr. Malagina teaches courses on disarmament and non-proliferation and military innovations and strategy for the Student of Strategic and Arms Control Studies Master's Program. Malagina graduated with honors from School of International Relations of St. Petersburg State University and holds a political science degree. She participated in expert meetings on nuclear arms control and strategic stability in Washington, Berlin, Rome, and London. Her areas of current academic research interests include the history of disarmament, diplomacy, global biosecurity issues, and WMD non-proliferation regimes. This session will be moderated by Dr. Nasir Hafiz. Dr. Hafiz is a director of research at SVI Islamabad. He holds a PhD from Department of International Relations, National Defense University, Islamabad. He has been associated with School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, as visiting research associate in South Asian Studies Center. His research areas are national and international security, nuclear strategy, nuclear diplomacy, non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, discourse analysis, strategic foresight, and scenario planning. With this, I would hand over the session to Dr. Nasir Hafiz to moderate the remaining of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Ladies and gentlemen, We are honored to have a very distinguished panel to discuss the responsible nuclear behavior in the next few minutes. But before I do that, I just would like to connect the debate today with a debate which happened yesterday on the space technologies. Dr. Ali Saroj was talking about Thucydides trap. So once I was preparing my notes for today's session, so there is another anecdote from the same Peloponnesian War, the Melian dialogue. And the master statement or the main proposition is that the strong do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. So though we talk of the human developments, modernizations, technological advancements, AI, and space, we fail to overcome and discipline the behavior of the powerful and protect the weak. Nuclear weapons are bad, they must be eliminated, and no responsible state should acquire them. The NPT nuclear weapon states, the responsible nuclear states, will eliminate whatever they have after a negotiation, which may begin at an early time in good faith. Almost 75 years have passed, but so far the so-called responsible state have not been able to do what they promised to do. This system of regulation under the NPT or the NPR has been working for some time, and some of the stakeholders are now working towards an informal, rule-based international system, which are being set according to their own interest and being applied on selective basis. The criteria are being set differently for different countries, and this discriminatory and preferential treatment is destabilizing regions and fueling arms race in certain parts of the world, especially in South Asia. In one of my personal interactions with a high-ranking US official a few years back, I asked him, in your opinion, who is the most responsible state in the world? And I was not surprised once he straight away said it is US. So with such a self-established mechanism of responsibility, how other nations can fit into this selected criteria is highly elusive. So what is this new system of responsible nuclear behavior, how it is being pursued, and why it is being pursued over and preferred over the existing NPT-based legal commitments? We will discuss today in this session with an eminent panel of speakers. So first of all, the floor would be, I would be asking Dr. Sultan to make his presentation. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Nasir Hafiz. Can we have the presentation? Thank you, SVI, for giving me an opportunity to share my perspective on this topic, which is responsible nuclear behavior, biases, and discrimination. And apologies to SVI that I borrowed this idea from your monogram of using Pakistan monument. I hope it is not copyrighted, sir. This topic, before I share my perspective, yesterday we had very two comprehensive presentations providing Pakistan's perspective on these issues. And today another two keynote speakers would be there. So they would be covering strategic aspects. So for me, it was a challenge what to cover and how to avoid repetition. So what I did was I opted to test the tactical issues or slightly technical issues to build a case, how worldviews or what Dr. Nasir was saying, the perspective from the outside about Pakistan and how we understand responsible nuclear behavior and what are the biases and discrimination. At the outset, I must state that the data that I'm going to show that is controversial. I do not necessarily endorse all these reports published by Western think tanks, but why I'm using it, because the same reports have always been used to target Pakistan and to build a case that Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear program, or Pakistan is spending much more than its capacity on its nuclear capability. So I'm going to refer to the same data and you will be able to understand where the truth lies. Yeah, okay. So I'll start with three main assertions. Acquisition of nuclear weapons is not a responsible act. However, if a country is faced with an existential threat, the only gold standard to prevent nuclear blackmail is by developing own credible nuclear deterrence capability. Number two, nuclear weapons brings responsibilities, but the largest share of responsibility lies with the major powers who have greater number of weapons. Number three, global nuclear order is inherently biased and discriminatory and favors mainly the major powers and their allies. Now, coming to who has more number of nuclear weapons? It's not a tricky question. If we see this data from 1945 to 2017, it was United States which has tested most number of nuclear weapons, more than 1,000. Then Russia 715 and China 45 and so on. India, Pakistan and North Korea only 5 nuclear tests over the past several years. This is another report which was published by the Federation of American Scientists, which talks about number of warheads with all the nuclear weapon states. United States and Russia, they are leading. Pakistan has been shown as having 170. I again reiterate that I do not endorse what they're saying. I have no knowledge to verify this data. India has 172 nuclear weapons. Why I'm showing this data is, till last year, all the reports every year, they indicated that Pakistan has more number of nuclear weapons than India, and Pakistan has fastest growing nuclear weapons program. It is for the first time that India has shown having more number of nuclear weapons. And this is a result of India-US nuclear deal, where India has been able to build more number of fissile material facilities, and that's why its number of nuclear warheads have also increased. Who is spending more on development and maintenance of nuclear inventories? This is again a report published by International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. If you see the data, United States in 2023 spent $51.5 billion alone in 1 year. Russia spent $8.3 billion, while Pakistan spent only $1 billion on its nuclear inventory. Again, just to reiterate, I do not have any information to corroborate, but the same reports have been used in the past to label Pakistan that it is spending more on its nuclear inventory. Interesting point over here is that India is spending 3 times more, and they have almost same number of nuclear weapons as Pakistan has. I don't know whether it's what the reason is about it. Over the past 5 years, the total money spent on nuclear inventories for the development and maintenance of nuclear weapons. United States has spent $212 billion. Russia, $37.32 billion. India, $11.55 billion. And Pakistan has spent, can you move? Yes, $3.87 billion over the past 5 years. So, irrespective of the accuracies, this data shows that India is spending much more than what Pakistan is spending on its nuclear inventory. It is, other than what it spends on its conventional nuclear capabilities, that is more than $70 billion. This NTI Nuclear Security Index, it gives its ranking every 4 years in the 2023 report, which came out. And officially, Pakistan does not share any data with the NTI, which is Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is an NGO as a matter of principle. The government of Pakistan doesn't share. But from the open source information which is available, they do rankings of certain countries which have nuclear potential. For example, in terms of securing material, countries which have more than 1 kilogram of plutonium, weapons-grade plutonium, there are 22. So out of these 22 countries, Russia stands at 18, Pakistan stands at 19, India at 20. In terms of protecting facilities, which include nuclear power plants, there are 46 countries. which are operating these facilities. And out of 46 countries, Russia and Pakistan share this common position of 32, while India is at 40. If you see this data produced by Western think tanks, for them, India is still a more responsible country than Russia and Pakistan, but the data shows something different. Looking at the nuclear non-proliferation regime and how nuclear responsibilities have been dealt by major nuclear weapon states and others. What happened to Grand Bargain? Grand Bargain was between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, where nuclear weapon state had committed under Article 6 of the NPT, they will give up their nuclear weapons. So after 50 years, there's no progress. So who bears more responsibility for the credibility of international NPT-based international nuclear non-proliferation regime? Looking towards South Asia, India and Pakistan had been actively involved while NPT was being negotiated. But once it was finalized and open for signatures, India declared that it is a nuclear apartheid and they are not going to sign. So Pakistan also decided unless India doesn't sign, Pakistan will not sign NPT and stayed out of this regime. But apart from NPT, Pakistan had been offering several proposals to India at the regional level to prevent nuclearization of South Asia, and all these proposals you can see over the years post 1970 when NPT was negotiated. But there was no reciprocity from Indian side. Comprehensive test ban treaty, it cannot enter into force unless all Annex 2 states, they ratify it. United States continues to refuse to ratify, and Russia has also withdrawn its ratification from the CTBT. India has refused to sign CTBT despite there was a strong push once India-US nuclear deal was being negotiated, and United States wanted some commitments from India that it will not test after this deal is culminated. Pakistan's position has been, it was not the first to test and it will not resume nuclear testing. Apart from this, Pakistan had also offered bilateral moratorium on nuclear testing in 1987 and more recently in 2016 once this criteria for an NSG was being discussed. But there was no response from the international community or support, and also from India. Fissile material cutoff treaty, which is an issue that is always taken, and Pakistan is projected the only holdout state which is stopping its discussion or negotiations at the Conference on Disarmament. Interestingly, it was not Pakistan, but United States. From 1995 to 2009, it opposed any verifiable treaty, and that is why no progress could be made on FMCT. So Pakistan was not the culprit at that time. In 2009, once under Obama administration, once US agreed to drop its verifiable precondition, Pakistan agreed to this program of work 1864, but the very next day, India objected that it will not compromise on its national security interests, but nobody points fingers towards India, and Pakistan continues to be the only country for rest of the international community as a holdout state which is impeding any progress on FMCT. Some of the important facts, because we have limited memory or short-term memory, or we tend to see what we like to see. As part of India-US nuclear deal, India had committed that it will work with United States for the conclusion of fissile material cutoff treaty. On the contrary, what we have seen, increase in India's fissile material production facilities. And some of you may remember that once Hyde Act was passed, because that was domestic law, without Hyde Act, India-US nuclear deal couldn't have matured. There was a precondition that in case India builds more fissile material facilities, US President will notify Congress about these facilities. I asked somebody at Congressional Research Service who deals with and makes updated reports. He said, nobody is asking and nobody is interested. But what we see that India has much more expanded fissile material production facilities now. Coming to export control regimes. These regimes came into being to reduce the possibility of misuse of dual-use technologies for military purposes. India, which was the primary reason for nuclear supplier group creation, because it misused peaceful application, the nuclear reactor which was provided for peaceful applications, produced plutonium, and that was used in 1974. And because of this act, one of the main reasons that NSG came into existence, but it was granted exemption from the NSG guidelines to operationalize India-US nuclear deal. Otherwise, that deal couldn't have been operationalized. India is also in violation of MTCR. It is using Russian-provided BrahMos. And this caveat of 300 kilometers, it says it's 290 kilometers. But more lately, it has increased the ranges also, and it is exporting BrahMos missiles. So it is in violation of MTCR as well. But India is seen as a responsible country. It was given membership of MTCR, Australia Group, and Wasnar arrangement. But it couldn't become member of the NSG because of principal objections by several countries, notably from Pakistan and China and some others. Now, coming to nuclear responsibilities and South Asia, it was not Pakistan, but India that introduced nuclear weapons in this region. And I've just explained how Cirrus reactor, that is Canada, Indian reactor, fueled by US, was used to extract plutonium and test a nuclear device in 1974. So that was the first episode of proliferation in South Asia, where a peaceful nuclear technology was misused to build a bomb and test in 1974. Not many people would know that in 1970, Pakistan made this effort to ban peaceful nuclear explosion because Pakistan had some information, or they were worried that probably India is going to use this peaceful nuclear explosion card. At that time, these studies were on, and they might test. So we wanted to push this resolution. United States and several other countries didn't agree, and that's why this resolution couldn't be passed. Post-1998, interestingly, once India tested its nuclear device, several of its ministers labeled it as a Hindu bomb. It didn't trigger any interest by the international community. But when Pakistan tested its nuclear device, it was given a religious identity of Islamic bomb. In terms of new war-fighting doctrines, what we see, how India is being labeled as responsible despite introducing all these war-fighting doctrines like Cold Star Doctrine, proactive operations, land-based surgical strikes, and in 2019, it also tried aerial surgical strikes. So in a nuclearized environment, a country which wants to exploit perceived space below strategic threshold is seen by international community as more responsible than others. India is also introducing new destabilizing technologies, ABM systems, S-400s provided by Russia. It has also tested anti-satellite weapons and introduced hypersonic weapons. All these technologies in India, Pakistan dyad are going to be destabilizing and cannot be termed as responsible behavior. To sum up, major nuclear weapon states have more influence and therefore greater responsibility to shape the global nuclear order. If they honor their NPT-related obligations, others will have no excuse not to restrain their nuclear ambitions. US, Russia, and few others have played significant role in perpetuating military competition in regions like South Asia. These countries also bear the responsibility to ensure that their actions do not lead to perpetual instability in the region. Finally, global nuclear non-proliferation regime is inherently discriminatory and biased. It is therefore important for countries like Pakistan to pursue policies that serve their own national security interests without being apologetic. Thank you.
An excellent presentation. I think he has been able to present a quantitative analysis of the data which is being used all over the world and present what all issues are really important to understand responsible nuclear behavior and what we really want them to be focused in the subsequent session. Thank you, Dr. Adil. I think you have already, covered a lot of ground which we would like our other panelists to cover. So without further ado, I think floor is yours, Dr. Vega.
Can I stay, or do you want me to go up to
Okay, you can start from here.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Sleek and Dr. Hafiz and SVI for inviting me to speak at such a, is that okay? Can you hear me okay? For inviting me to speak at such a prestigious gathering. It's my second visit to Islamabad. Unfortunately, a short one this time, but it's a great pleasure to be here again. I also want to thank Mr. Hamdan Khan for always helping getting me here and his support. So what does it mean to talk about responsible nuclear behaviors? One answer to this question is that it's an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. This position was expressed by the then UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, when he said in 2013 that, quote, "There are no right hands that can handle these wrong weapons." And Adol talked about possession of nuclear weapons not being a responsible act. This viewpoint underpins the views of those states that have signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And it was given its most recent articulation in a powerful statement by the 6 states that make up the New Agenda Coalition in the working paper that they submitted to the Preparatory Committee for the 2026 NPT Review Conference. The working paper tabled by the NAC stated that, quote, "We strongly reject attempts to create a distinction between so-called responsible and irresponsible nuclear weapons possession or behavior." Such a statement, I think, was targeted particularly at states like the United States and the United Kingdom that have sought to draw such distinctions in their speeches and statements, especially about Russia's overt manipulation of nuclear threats in Ukraine. The NAC statement overlooks, though, that there has been what has been called a responsibility turn in security thinking. We heard yesterday in the excellent panel on space how satellites that are in space can be used for civilian purposes, but also those same satellites have potential military uses. And as a result, it was argued that we need to focus on responsible behaviors and not on the capabilities themselves. Similarly, there's been discussions around what should count as responsible behaviors in cyberspace. And now, of course, there's a conversation beginning about what constitutes responsible behavior in relation to AI. So we might ask the question, why not a dialogue on responsible nuclear behaviors? Now, one attempt to push this debate forward was the NPT working paper tabled by the US, the UK, and French governments in the 2020 NPT review cycle. And my expectation is that this paper will be something that these 3 governments, particularly the US and UK, will seek to take forward in the 2026 review cycle. So I think it's an important paper that we should reflect upon. Working paper 70 begins with the proposition that it was building on the P5 leader's statement of 3 January 2022, which affirmed, of course, the landmark Reagan-Gorbachev statement from November 1985 that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. WP70 identified what it called principles and responsible practices that the 3 states were committed to following to fulfill their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT, which Adol was just talking about. And they argued that as responsible custodians of nuclear weapons, their language, they were working towards their eventual elimination as required by Article 6. Now, a key responsible practice identified by the P3 in that paper was the rejection of what was described as, quote, irresponsible rhetoric concerning potential nuclear use intended for military coercion, intimidation, or blackmail. We recall, they went on, that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war, end quote. These lines were written before Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, of course, and Putin's overt manipulation of nuclear threats to deter NATO's direct involvement in the war. But since the Russian invasion, the P3 has been quick to level the language of irresponsible nuclear behavior at Russia. Now, I think there's little prospect of WP70 gaining traction with the other two members of the P5. The world looks very different 3 years on from the leaders' declaration of 2022. And a key component of this is the growing conviction in some Western circles that the United States and its allies need to prepare to manage the threat from a combined number of nuclear competitors. The problem was set out well by Vipin Narang before he left his role in the Pentagon in an important speech he gave at CSIS on the 1st of August of this year. The Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy said that the United States faces, quote, an unprecedented mix of multiple nuclear revisionist challengers who are uninterested in arms control or risk reduction efforts, each rapidly modernizing and expanding their nuclear arsenals and openly threatening to employ nuclear weapons to achieve their aims. These challengers' actions have forced us to shift to a more competitive approach, end quote. Now, although it is not as yet official US nuclear policy, David Sanger had a piece in the New York Times a few weeks later revealing that President Biden had approved in March a new strategy document that called for US forces to prepare for a possible coordinated nuclear confrontation with Russia, China, and North Korea. The difficulty here is that the United States appears to be framing its nuclear strategy in terms of being in a position of parity with the combined nuclear forces of those it sees in the axis of upheaval, to borrow a title from a recent Foreign Affairs article. But such a position means that it must, by extension, have nuclear superiority over any one of those who make up the list of revisionist nuclear challenges. I think 3 key implications follow from this, which raise worrying questions about what counts as responsible nuclear behaviors. The first is that it becomes extremely hard to see how a meaningful arms control agreement becomes possible among the major nuclear powers unless China, and especially Russia, are willing to accept a position of inferiority vis-à-vis the United States, which seems highly implausible. The second implication is that whilst the US government claims that it's been forced into this competitive approach by the actions of its nuclear challengers, and that it's only acting defensively, the language, of course, in WP70, such a strategy will clearly be perceived as highly offensive by Russia and China. China is already expanding its nuclear forces, primarily, I think, because of concerns about the survivability of its nuclear forces to a panoply of US strategic weapons, conventional and nuclear. And it's really hard to see how the US position, as it appears to be evolving, can do anything to reduce the pressures driving increased strategic arms competition between the major states. The third implication is that I think these developments raise profound concerns about crisis stability and crisis management. There are 2 dimensions here. The first is that the advent of emerging and disruptive technologies like cyber and AI raise worrisome questions about whether the confidence in the other side's nuclear restraint might erode in times of crisis. This could create a situation where decision makers operating under high levels of stress, very short decision time, and in an environment where AI decision support tools may be promoting escalatory and not de-escalatory actions, might take the fateful step humanity has managed to avoid for the past 79 years. There is a further twist here, which is that nuclear-armed states that believe, perhaps mistakenly, that they have secured first-mover advantage in these systems in terms of holding at risk an adversary or adversaries' nuclear assets, may be more willing to engage in nuclear brinkmanship in times of crisis. I don't have time to develop this, but we clearly need to find ways of putting guardrails around these dangerous escalatory possibilities. Working Paper 70, I believe, is an important attempt to map out what such behaviours might look like. But the discussion of responsible practices in the paper can be expected to be perceived by others as resting uneasily with the direction of travel that the major nuclear powers appear set on. If this somewhat dystopian nuclear future that I have set out is a realistic one, then the challenge must be to devise better crisis management and, crucially, crisis prevention practices. This is recognised in Working Paper 70, and I think it could be one of the areas where there could perhaps be some development of an international consensus, both among the NPT N5 and Pakistan and India going forwards. Here I would echo the conclusion of the General in his excellent keynote last night when he said that, quote, communications are critical. They are indeed, and Basics Nuclear Responsibilities Programme that I am part of has made this a key part of our engagement with Track 2 1.5 partners in Pakistan and India over the past 3 years. And I'd be happy to talk more about this in Q&A. 62 years ago this month, US President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev looked down the barrel of the nuclear gun. The letters they exchanged between them were critical in developing empathy and even trust. That in turn was critical to the de-escalation of the crisis, and I've written about this at length and have a new book forthcoming with my colleague Marcus Holmes that has this is one of the case studies. After the crisis, both eagerly sought to institutionalize a regular, trusted channel, and the hotline was born. It was described by that great of strategic studies, Thomas Schelling, as, quote, the best single example of a confidence-building measure to reduce anxiety in a crisis, end quote. The need for such confidence-building measures remains an urgent one. In the end, as Kennedy appreciated, as he climbed a rung of the escalation ladder by imposing a naval quarantine on Cuba and placing US nuclear forces on defense condition 3, we have nuclear crises because we have nuclear weapons. But until we can work out how to remove what the writer Martin Amis called Einstein's monsters, there will be a compelling case for governments to think about and practice responsible nuclear behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wheeler, for an excellent presentation. Dr. Wheeler has been trying a very difficult task of bridging the internal contradiction within the nuclear affairs. I just remember that the start of the nuclear program with a letter by Dr. Szilard to Einstein. Those scientists which promoted the project of development of nuclear weapons, the moment they were tested, the same scientists again wrote a letter to Truman to not to use these weapons. So what I'm trying to indicate is that the internal contradiction within the nuclear affairs has been right from the day the nuclear weapons were invented. And gradually now, we are not in the era where knowledge used to be power. Now we are in a constructivist era where power is knowledge. The control over the narrative, the control over the media, the control over the information and the discourse has resulted into the powerful countries of turning and twisting the affairs the way they want, and even the morality and the behavior. There's no incentive for the powerful to give up its power within this existing materialist paradigm. So if we continue to look at the world from the realist perspective, so we are not going to find any solution to that. And that is what I think Dr. Wheeler is struggling with that. So now with this, I think now we have our last speaker from Russia, Dr. Anastasia. Floor is yours, please.
As you may notice by the introduction, I will refer to some wild nature and ecology in my remarks, so please do not get surprised. In the last 20 years or so, the word responsibility and its derivatives have penetrated the narrative of global politics and multiplied in various security-related areas. With regard to nuclear issues, several components of nuclear responsible behavior can be distinguished. Responsible behavior in relation to nuclear export controls and compliance with the norm of horizontal non-proliferation, responsible behavior towards the IAEA nuclear safeguards, responsible behavior in relation to reducing the risks of nuclear war, responsibility in relation to obligations under Article 6 of the NPT and compliance with the norm of vertical non-proliferation, responsible uses of peaceful nuclear energy, appropriate physical protection, control and accounting of nuclear materials, and adherence to the norm on the moratorium on nuclear testing. A responsibility-driven nuclear policy includes voluntary transparency about national nuclear doctrines and arsenals, sustainable nuclear risk reduction efforts, effective crisis communication channels, firm restraints on potentially escalatory activities, policies to keep humans in the loop for command control and use of nuclear weapons. Finally, responsible nuclear states are expected to keep their nuclear arsenals safe and secure. Correspondingly, criticism have implicitly or explicitly called out offending states for deviating from behavior associated with responsible nuclear states. In the mouth of civil society, appealing to responsibility has become a way to either reward a state possessor of nuclear weapons for good behavior or pressure it for lowering the nuclear threshold and alleged failure to achieve deeper nuclear cuts. Since September 2017, when Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons opened for signature, and especially since January 2021, when it entered into force, the multilateral non-proliferation regime has splitted into polarized camps characterized by starkly differing views on the value, role, and risks of nuclear weapons. As it is seen from the standpoint of TPNW proponents, not one nuclear-armed state is now in negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons. These, what TPNW community calls nuclear irresponsible behavior. In contrast, the states that have negotiated this treaty have acted responsibly. Yet, TPNW proponents often reduce nuclear responsibility to a binary of possession or abolition. Either nuclear weapon states are actively disarming and reducing their arsenal size and therefore are behaving responsibly, or they are modernizing their arsenals and behaving irresponsibly. From my point of view, this approach is a short-sighted, unjustified simplification. Immediate disarmament is not the sole means for states to demonstrate their accountability, mitigate nuclear threats, and pave the way for further nuclear reductions. Proponents of the TPNW view nuclear weapons in a moral binary of good versus bad, nuclear disarmament versus nuclear deterrence, morality versus security, humanitarian concerns versus national interests, and compliance versus violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, nuclear responsibility is more intricate. Any simplistic approach that ignores all the factors that affect strategic stability, leads to false accusations against nuclear countries and risks making the already tense geopolitical situation even more unstable. I assume that in any state which possesses nuclear weapons, there are what I call the white sharks and the lions. In the context of our discussion, I call the white sharks those who are proponents of unilateralism. They are loners who opt for unilateral measures to enhance national security. They rely on the development and ongoing modernization of national nuclear weapons, which are not subject to any legally binding international agreements. What I call the lions are social animals for whom cooperation is a natural state. That is, in the context of our conversation on responsible nuclear behavior, the lions rely on combination of military and non-military measures, among which arms control and diplomacy occupy a worthy place. I assume that the American lions, that is, supporters of arms control diplomacy in the United States, hope that in the post-2026 order, when the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty expires, Russia and the United States, under more or less favored circumstances, will continue to adhere to the quantitative limitations established by the treaty. Since 2023, there have been calls to make the concept of responsible nuclear behavior an integral part of G7, G20 agendas, as well as the NPT review process. At a summit in Hiroshima in May 2023, G7 leaders committed to promoting, I quote, responsible nuclear behavior, end quote, including risk reduction measures and greater transparency about states' nuclear arsenals. Greater reliance on the idea of responsible nuclear behavior in this context derives from the stance that traditional arms control agreements, where nuclear powers formally agreed to reduce their arsenals, have come to an end. So, to sustain nuclear order, a set of principles for responsible nuclear behavior is needed alongside policies that will, and here I will quote American experts, encourage responsible behaviors and stigmatize irresponsible ones, end quote. In American experts and diplomatic narratives, this concept is called behavioral arms control. Behavioral arms control is promoted, and I quote again, a new approach that will allow Washington to further strengthen relations with the US allies and partners, including in the Global South, to involve a wider and more diverse group of states in promoting responsible nuclear behavior, end quote. So, I can imagine that the American lions are trying to give nuclear arms control a chance, secure the norm of nuclear restraint, energize international expert dialogue on how to halt and reverse the nuclear arms race, and how to prevent mutual suicide. To my mind, the idea of behavioral arms control was introduced by what I call the American lions to moderate the growing appetites of the American white sharks. Recently, there have been an intellectual fashion among the Western experts to place arguments about responsible nuclear behavior in the context of conversations about the nuclear order. In such a framework, all sovereign states are divided into those that behave responsibly and maintain the nuclear order, or irresponsibly, that is, undermine order, challenge the principles and norms that construct the nuclear order. Thus, nuclear order narrative replaces the strategic stability narrative. In the West, it's not trendy anymore to talk about preserving the international security architecture based on the principles of reciprocity, balance of interests, and equal, indivisible security for all states. Instead of the idea of global strategic stability, the Euro-Atlantic epistemic community promotes the idea of rules-based nuclear order. In the package with the rules-based nuclear order, there is a scale for measuring to what extent the behavior of each state is responsible or irresponsible in nuclear domain. It seems that the United States is ready to negotiate something in the field of arms control and proliferation, arms control and or non-proliferation, on terms imposed by Washington. And an opponent who is not going to negotiate with the Americans on the terms which are imposed on Washington is immediately awarded the status of irresponsible player who refers to negotiate. The American expert narrative has firmly established the idea that arms control should not be an end in itself, and that the United States should be ready to compete to ensure its interests if its opponents refuse to negotiate with the US. So, when we closely examine the concept of nuclear responsibilities, we cannot help but notice attempts to create another coalition of the willing, which will convene around the idea of responsible nuclear behavior. This coalition is supposed to strengthen the foundations of an American-centric, rules-based order, and in my opinion, this is not a healthy approach, and to prove my point, let me once again refer to wild nature. When some species introduced in its new environment disrupts the ecosystem, it is called an invasive species. Since the 20th century, invasive species have become serious economic, social, and environmental threats worldwide. European rabbits were first introduced in Australia in the 18th century and later became widespread. Such a wild rabbit population are invasive species in Australia and causing millions of dollars worth of damage to crops. So my point is that before introducing a new creature to ecosystem of nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, one should mind, if you don't mind, I use the term collateral damage from invasive species. The concept of behavioral arms control and responsible conduct of whatsoever introduced in the domains of life science research, outer space exploration, governance of AI innovations, cyber domain, may be a good solution amid the absence of understanding how to manage the security risks emerging from the technologies and industries which are growing promptly and on a large scale. But the concept of responsible nuclear behavior and behavioral arms control should not become invasive species in nuclear arms control ecosystem. Innovative concepts should not displace legally binding arms control agreements or damage regional or global security architecture by legitimizing the expansion of existing military alliances and building new ones. The idea of responsible nuclear behavior must not be an ideological foundation for the construction of American-centric global network of military coalitions. To my mind, old-school nuclear arms control is still far from being out of service. I don't think it is right to talk about classical nuclear arms control as a rusty, outdated airplane which will never take off again. I suggest talking about nuclear arms control as a stylish and robust vehicle that will never go out of fashion. You could see such a vehicle at the entrance to Marriott Hotel Islamabad, Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. This vehicle requires regular technical maintenance. So does nuclear arms control. The mechanism of nuclear arms control does require technical maintenance, but the maintenance work should not interfere with the design of the engine, which is the heart of the car. Like the heart of the car's motto, the engine of nuclear arms control is built of the principles of equality, reciprocity, indivisible security for all states. Classical nuclear arms control is based on the idea of controlling capabilities. Ignoring the vital interests of any sovereign state leads to undermining global strategic stability. Therefore, it is necessary to keep the concept of strategic empathy as a part of formula of responsible nuclear behavior. Strategic empathy is the ability to understand the interests, motivations, needs, and limitations of the other side. The concept of responsible nuclear behavior should not be just used to justify expansion of military alliances and other discriminatory or punitive political practices. I guess I'll stop it there. Thank you for your attention.
I think with this such an animated presentation with metaphors from the natural world, bringing in the white sharks and the lions, and the struggle which is currently happening at the within the American system, those who claim to lead the entire mechanism of arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. I really thank you for, I think, making us all understand what are exactly what are the problems and the challenges at the heart of the arms control debate, and why the legal framework is being preferred over a behavior-based, rule-based, a new system. So let us all, think of making the old cars still fashionable and, work for the maintenance of those things. So with this, the House is open for the discussion. So the rules are known to you. Please identify yourself and then keep your comments short so that we can have almost, I think this is a very important subject, and I'm sure most of you would be having questions. So let us give chance to most of you. So Dr. Saleh, we will come back to you.
Thank you. I think we had three excellent presentations, and one could have asked any number of questions based on the presentation, but I just want to ask a very brief question to Dr. Wheeler. Is it realistic to demand China's participation in the arms control negotiations without even mentioning the two other armed nuclear weapon states, Britain and France?
So I think this is a model way of asking a question. So I would request all of you to please be brief, pinpoint to the panelists to whom you want to. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, it'll be a bit more difficult for me. I think Dr. Anastasia brilliantly summed up that there are many levels to responsibility. What Dr. Adil was pointing out was a relative nuclear responsibility with regards to the regional behavior of India and the global powers. But being a student of strategic studies and non-proliferation and been teaching it for the last 8-9 years within Pakistan, I think there's also an element of absolute nuclear responsibility as well that exists, that if we focus, yes, in the region, we have to focus in the region, what's happening in the region, but also looking inwards as far as the things that we can do, which are not matters related to nuclear security or any securitized matter for that matter. The problem is that Pakistan's peculiar history and the unequal role of military, everything becomes securitized. And I think this is another area in Pakistan which is also affected by that. So Dr. Adil, if I saw your presentation, it was brilliant, but I would have liked, as far as had there been towards the end, a portion on things where Pakistan can be more responsible matters which are not related to security, matters which may not be related to the rivalry between India and Pakistan, because I'm sure when we talk about responsibility, we can look inwards and see the things that we can improve, which you talked about NTI framework, which shows your responsibility with regards to safety and security. Now, that isn't a matter that is conditional upon India. So if we're 32, we should not be happy with being 32. We can try to be in the top 10 as well. So that's just my point of view, and I would like your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, yes, please.
Uh,
But be sure this is not the model one.
Sorry.
You have to follow the previous
I
model.
will be brief. Here is Dr. Adnan Bukhari from Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Qaid-e-Azam University. My question is to Professor Anastasia from Russia. Excellent presentation, I would say. But my question is that you are optimistic, I appreciate it. But given the global power contestation at the international level, in which United States, Russia, and China are particularly at the competitive, play at the international level. So how can we convince and push for the US, Russia, and China for arms control, particularly amid the situation in which the global arms control order is in flux and it is declining? Thank you very much.
So, okay, one last, Dr. Saab, at the end. So then we can have, okay.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imran Ahmed Khan from Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission. My question would be directed to the whole panel. We have seen in the history that this sanction regime and this, punishment criteria did not work so well among many of the states that did not conform to the idea of this behavior, responsible behavior. What do you think the choices we have with the UN Security Council besides these sanctions, so that if the country like Japan or South Korea decides to go or withdraw, like North Korea has done, what choices do you think we have in our hand to combat that situation? Thank you.
We can start with Dr. Veera. Would you like to start with the response?
Yeah, of course. Okay. Maybe I can sort of also circle back a little bit to a couple of things that Anastasia said, which I'd like to pick up as well. So, Dr. Salik, picking up your point about China and the UK-French question, let me circumvent it slightly. I don't see any prospect of China joining any kind of arms control regime where it doesn't have parity with the other major powers. And the difficulty is, as I was saying, is I don't believe the United States so far has reached a point where it's willing to accept that China should be in a position with parity with the US. And I think there's a really interesting precedent here from the 1960s. The Soviet Union only sat down to begin arms control with the United States in the SALT process when it achieved strategic nuclear parity. So, and I think at the moment, Washington is extremely reluctant to think about a situation where China would have parity, because clearly that multiple nuclear competitor argument suggests that they're going to want superiority over the combined, they're going to have parity with the combined number, which inevitably means superiority over China. I think there's an important dimension here, which is that the US wants to retain a position. I mean, this is my reading of it. The US wants to retain a position where it has nuclear options in relation to a future crisis over Taiwan. And there's an interesting question about escalation dominance here. There's certainly a lot of discussions outside of the government process about the way nuclear weapons might play in a future Taiwan crisis, how far that will permeate official thinking, how far it might shape a future Trump or even Harris administration. It's difficult, of course, to say, but I don't think we should not take note of it. If there were to be an arms control regime in which there were significant deep cuts, then the British and French governments are both on record as saying that they would then participate in a multilateral process, but only when the process was multilateral. And I think it would have to, obviously, given the size of those arsenals, there would have to be a significant cut in existing forces. So I don't think we're anywhere near that kind of position, sadly, at the moment. And I wanted to make a broader point about arms control and kind of come back on Anastasia's excellent presentation. I was trying to think of a way of getting the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, which is very, very clever, but I can't quite get my brain to work on that at the moment, but I'll think about it. But the fundamental problem, as you know, is that arms control is predicated on the idea that adversaries can share a common interest in restraint. But where is the common interest in restraint? And I think that was the question that we were just hearing as well about the global power contestation. Where is the common interest in restraint today when you look at something like the speech that VP Narang has just made, and you think about the David Sanger report in the New York Times, which I suspect is very authoritative, that the Biden administration has approved this strategy document. So I don't see how the traditional model can work. And then I think it was a very interesting discussion of behavioral arms control, and I followed that debate as well. But it seems to me, I mean, I've spent the last 15 years of my academic career working on the challenge of building trust between adversaries. But I've started to realize in recent years that you can't even begin to think about building trust between adversaries if they're in relationships of deep distrust. And actually, what we need to start thinking about is how we can dissolve distrust. And I have a big new research project on this with my colleague at BASIC and Dr. Chiara Cavasio and a colleague at Birmingham in the School of Management, Mark Saunders, trying to develop a cross-disciplinary, coming back to your interests, a cross-disciplinary framework for thinking about how we dissolve distrust. But I don't see how behavioral arms control can offer anything, and I share that with you, whilst we have these relationships of deep distrust. There's got to be some way of chipping away at the distrust first before you can begin to even think about ideas like behavioral arms control. So that would be. And on the UN Security Council, very quickly, I mean, of course, there is an article in the NPT which provides for withdrawal from the treaty under extreme national circumstances. That was the one that the DPRK exercised in 2003 when it exited the treaty. Now, a lot of Western states will argue the DPRK didn't go through the exiting from the treaty in the way that they should have done legally, and we can debate that. But there is a withdrawal clause, a supreme national interest clause in the treaty. And Japan and South Korea, if they ever exercise that clause, would be within their legal rights to do so. Now, the issue that arose in terms of sanctions over the Islamic Republic of Iran was in relation to the argument that they were not in compliance with their non-proliferation commitments under the treaty. So I think it's a different circumstance if states choose to leave the treaty. However, under the provisions of the Charter, the Security Council could adopt under Chapter 7, could adopt resolutions under Chapter 7, claiming that Japan or South Korea's future withdrawal from the treaty was a threat to international peace and security, at which point my understanding of international law is that that would then supersede those legal, that would supersede potentially the NPT, or you could make that argument that this was now an international threat to international peace and security. But the idea that the Security Council would be in a position where it would be able to engage in that kind of collective enforcement action, I think is extremely unlikely. And if Japan and South Korea do leave the treaty, it will be because they've lost confidence in the US extended nuclear deterrent, because they believe that the United States is no longer willing to sacrifice New York. I mean, de Gaulle famously put it, would the United States ever sacrifice New York for Paris? And that was the genesis of the French nuclear deterrent. Would the United States today sacrifice New York, Chicago for Seoul or Tokyo? Is the question that a lot of people are asking. Thank you.
Dr. Anastasia, would you like to say something? Yeah.
Okay. If you might recognize, I like to think with metaphors. So I first responded to your metaphor of putting pressure. I guess any sovereign state, if it experiences pressure, the response will be not cooperation. So I guess we should think of inclusion, and ecosystem. Exercise, whenever it is possible, strategic empathy and sustain and strengthen the norm. Repeat and exercise, whenever it is possible, recognition that nuclear arms control is an essential, classical, legally binding nuclear arms control is essential element in the foundation of the ecosystem. So continuous practices and continuous contributions of all the members of this ecosystem will at least safeguard the environment. This is my first point. My second point, again, this is about norms and ideas which should be exercised and recognized by all the members of the ecosystem. Solving national security problems solely through military forces is a short-sighted perspective. So diplomacy, together with careful consideration of all factors that affect strategic stability, is an essential thing. So recognition and decision-making according to this principle will contribute to stabilizing the environment and create environment more conducive for the search for common interest and restraint. And if thinking how we can operationalize the idea of common interest and restraint in relations, at least between these three states that you have mentioned, I would suggest two ideas for your consideration. The first one, absence of any changes in the daily activities of the strategic nuclear forces, changes only in the combat control systems. And the second, the absence of activity at the central storage facilities for non-strategic weapons. This can be also recognized and rewarded as a stabilizing effort. Thank you.
First of all, okay. Dr. Anastasia used this metaphor of Rolls-Royce. It is interesting to see the same thing from a different lens, that this Rolls-Royce standing outside, you can enjoy, but you cannot move it. And if you want to move it, you need lots of money, and it will not be cost effective. So that is what arms control regime is. NPT based, it is showpiece, but it is not working. And how can it work when 3 of the nuclear weapon states are outside the NPT regime? So yes, it is good that NPT-based regime, and we keep talking about these, that it needs some modification. I think unless it takes into account the ground realities and takes into consideration of all the states, the interests, only then an ideal regime can work. On the second metaphor of rabbits, again, that's very interesting, and from a different perspective, I was just wondering why major powers are inclined to introduce those rabbits in South Asia, which is kind of creating instability between India and Pakistan. And it is going to have that collateral damage. So one can use these metaphors, and again, it's a matter of perspective, a lens, and or images that you want to have about different regions. Ali Mustafa, yeah, your question about I never use this NTI index to showcase that we are doing very good. Nuclear security is an ongoing process, and there's always room for improvement. The idea of showing that NTI index, which we do not endorse officially, was that despite all, and this same data has been used very frequently to malign Pakistan, that it is not as responsible as it should be, whereas India is a very responsible country. So from their data, from their lens, even that, the kind of information that open source available is, Pakistan is faring much better than what India is doing. And I was just referring, not endorsing the NTI data. And I agree about your concern about securitization of this debate, but my topic was about biases and discrimination and how I see from a Pakistani lens about nuclear responsibilities. You can have a different perspective. Finally, on Imran's question about if Japan and South Korea goes nuclear, how to prevent Security Council. First of all, UN Security Council is again a political body headed by or influenced by major power. Secondly, they are in a way already under nuclear umbrella, so Japan and South Korea. Third, it is for those states to decide if their security interest demand and if they want to go to nuclear. I don't think so. Personally, it's my opinion, it is of my concern. And likewise, if Pakistan went nuclear, we went for our own security interests, so nobody else should be concerned about why we acquired nuclear weapons. So it is the leadership of those countries to decide what is good in their interest. Thank you.
So I think we have another round of questions? Can we have? But I think so. Our next guest speaker or the keynote speaker is around. So I would conclude this session. Ladies and gentlemen, we had a very good discussion on a very important and a very challenging subject. It is not a settled debate that what is the responsible nuclear behavior. Because the paradigm or the paradigm with which we are looking at the international system is a realist system. As long as the wolves will keep on blaming the lambs of muddling their water downstream. The same animation from the jungle world. As long as the lambs will not have sufficient protection from the wolves, the lambs will continue to be the target or being accused of muddling the water. So I think instead of working on to the responsible behavior in the space, in the nuclear, in other things, we need to also focus on responsible human behavior. If we consider that the states are an extension of the human behavior, so we need to realize that there are some very faulty assumptions behind the realist paradigm, which says that the human nature is corrupt, is selfish. So I think that does not completely define the human nature. So the intellectual, I think this is the purpose of these debates here in forums like this, is to challenge the existing framework, challenge the given, so that we come up with new solutions, as Dr. Wheelers is attempting to understand how the distrust can be dissolved, so that we can, from the ashes of the distrust, we can create trust. So with this, we come to the end, and I would request to join me in the round of applause for all my panelists. Please. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you to all the speakers and moderator for insightful discussions. Now I would like to invite Dr. Naeem Salik, Executive Director, SVI, to present conference mementos to speakers and moderator. First, I would like to invite Dr. Adil Sultan to receive his conference memento. Now, I would request Dr. Nicholas Wheeler to request his conference memento. Now, I would request Dr. Anastasia Malikina to receive her conference memento. As this session comes to an end, I would like to thank all the speakers for their insights, and all the audience for their active engagement and participation. Thank you, everyone.